Vivid verses.
The first time Carla mentioned the word separation, it was on a Tuesday evening, and she said it the way you mention switching phone carriers, casually with a kind of practiced ease that told me she'd been rehearsing the sentence for weeks. I was at the kitchen counter, opening the mail. She was behind me, seated at the table with a glass of wine she'd already half finished, and when I turned around to look at her, her eyes were steady. Not nervous, not regretful, prepared. "I think we need to talk about whether this is still working," she said. I set the mail down. I looked at her, really looked at her, and I did something she probably didn't expect. I nodded. "Okay," I said. "Let's talk." She blinked. I think she braced herself for a different reaction. But I've never been a man who loses his composure when the ground shifts. Losing composure is expensive. It costs you information, leverage, clarity. And in that moment, watching her shoulders stay square and her wine glass stay perfectly still on the table, I understood that I needed every bit of all three. I sat down across from her. She talked. I listened. She said the word unhappy 4 times in the first 5 minutes, and I noticed she never once said the word us, only I. She said she felt like she'd been invisible for a long time. She said she needed to rediscover herself. She said she thought we'd grown into different people. All of it might have been true. I wasn't going to argue about any of it. What I was doing, quietly beneath the surface of that conversation, was cataloging. There's a part of my mind that operates like a separate room. Cool, orderly, methodical, and it never fully shuts down. While I held her gaze and asked calm, measured questions, that room was filing things away. The rehearsed quality of her language. The fact that she'd chosen Tuesday, when I typically worked late and came home tired. The specific phrases she used, invisible, rediscovered, different people, that sounded less like spontaneous feeling and more like a script that had been refined over time. I didn't accuse her of anything that night. I asked her what she wanted to do. She said she wasn't sure yet. I said that was fine, we could take our time. She seemed slightly thrown by that. She went to bed early. I stayed up. I went to the desk in the second bedroom, the room she called my home office, and I unlocked the bottom drawer. Inside was a folder I'd put together over 2 years prior, after a conversation with a colleague whose own divorce had cost him everything he'd built. That conversation had planted a seed I'd hoped would never need water. It had been watered now. I didn't open the folder that night. I didn't need to. I knew what was in it. I just needed to know it was still there, the prenuptial agreement, the asset inventory from the year we married, the records of every account, every property deed, every financial instrument I brought into the marriage and maintained in my name alone. My lawyer at the time had called it belt and suspenders planning. I called it prudence. I closed the drawer. I went to bed. I lay on my side of the mattress and listened to Carla's breathing in the dark, and I thought, she's already decided. She's just not ready to say the full sentence yet. I gave her 3 more weeks. It came out in pieces over those weeks, the way these things always do. First, she started sleeping later, which she never used to do. Then she started going out on Thursday evenings without much explanation. Then, one Saturday morning, she left her phone on the counter while she showered, and a name came up in the preview. Just a first name, a man's name, one I didn't recognize. Theo. I didn't touch the phone. I didn't need to. That name was enough. I've done enough complex problem solving in my life to know that data has a shape, and when enough data points cluster in one direction, you don't need to collect every last piece. You already know the shape of the answer. You move on to deciding what to do with it. I called my lawyer that same afternoon. Not from the house, not from my cell. From the parking lot of a hardware store 2 miles away, on a Saturday, because I'm thorough. My lawyer's name is Warren, and he's the least theatrical man I've ever met. He talks about divorce law the way an engineer talks about load-bearing walls, precisely, without sentiment, with complete attention to what will hold and what will crack. I'd kept him on a modest retainer since a business dispute 3 years prior, and he picked up on the second ring. I gave him a summary. He asked 4 questions. Then he said, "You still have everything we set up?" "Everything," I said. "Good," he said. "Don't move anything. Don't close anything. Don't change any designations. I'll pull the prenup file Monday, and we'll go over the current landscape." "What's my exposure?" I asked. There was a brief pause. "Honestly, if she signed what I think she signed, and you've kept things structured the way I think you have, minimal." I thanked him. I drove home. I made dinner. Carla came home around 7 and said the errands had taken longer than expected. I said that was fine. We met at Warren's office on a Wednesday. It was a quiet suite on the 3rd floor of a low-rise building. Bookshelves, a long table, the faint smell of coffee that had been brewed hours ago. Warren had the prenup laid out with sticky tabs and a yellow legal pad. He walked me through it in about 40 minutes. The document was airtight. Everything I'd owned prior to the marriage, the investment accounts, the commercial property I'd inherited, the business interest, was clearly ring-fenced. We'd structured it that way deliberately, both of us clear-eyed about what we were doing, both of us represented by separate counsel. Carla had had her own attorney review it. She'd signed it of her own free will, in good health, without coercion, in front of 2 witnesses. She'd also, it turned out, largely forgotten about it. I knew this because of how she behaved over the past several weeks. The confidence in her posture, the way she'd started looking at apartments online and left the browser open once, as if she hadn't thought to close it. She was doing the arithmetic of her future, and in that arithmetic, she appeared to be including assets that had never been hers to count. "She's going to be surprised," Warren said, not unkindly. "Yes," I said. "Do you want to give her a heads up before we initiate anything formally?" I thought about it. I genuinely thought about it. There was a version of me, a softer version, maybe, or a more sentimental one, who might have sat her down before any papers were filed and said, "I need you to understand what you're walking into." Given her a chance to recalibrate. But that version of me had also watched her tell me she was going out for errands while she was texting someone named Theo, and it had watched her rehearse the word separation until it came out smooth. "No," I said. "Let the process do what it's supposed to do." Warren nodded. "Okay, then let me explain what the next 90 days look like." She filed first, which I'd expected. Her attorney sent the initial petition in mid-November. It was worded in broad, sweeping language about irreconcilable differences and equitable distribution of marital assets, and it included a list of assets that was, to put it plainly, creative. Several items on that list I'd owned before we ever went on a first date. One item, a piece of commercial real estate, she'd been to exactly once. I was in the kitchen when my phone buzzed with Warren's message. She filed, "We're ready. Call me when you can." I set the phone face down on the counter. I finished making my coffee. I took it to the back patio and sat in the cold morning air for a few minutes, just breathing. There was grief in it. I want to be honest about that. Whatever else was true, there was real grief underneath all the strategy. We'd had years together that had contained genuine warmth, genuine partnership. I didn't hate her. I didn't blame her for wanting out. I blamed her, if anything, for the method, for the planning that happened in secret, for the months of quiet maneuvering, for the assumption that I was too distracted or too trusting to see what was forming. But grief and action aren't mutually exclusive. I've always known that. You can feel one thing and do another. You can be sad about a door closing and still make sure the lock is turned properly on your way out. I finished my coffee. I called Warren. The response Warren filed was measured, detailed, and from what he told me, about as welcome as a cold wind through a window that was supposed to be closed. Her attorney called his office within 48 hours. Warren's assistant relayed the gist, They wanted to discuss the prenup's validity. Warren told them they were welcome to discuss whatever they liked, and that he'd see them in mediation. There were 2 mediation sessions. I'll skip most of the texture of those rooms, the fluorescent lighting, the water pitchers, the long silences while attorneys conferred in corners, and get to the substance, which is this. There was nothing to dispute. The prenup was clean. The asset documentation was meticulous. Every account I maintained separately had a paper trail that went back to before the marriage. Every item on her attorney's creative list had a corresponding deed, record, or statement showing it had never been jointly owned. By the second session, I could see in her face. Carla sat across the long conference table, and for most of the first session, she'd had the composed expression of someone who believes they're holding good cards. By the afternoon of the second session, that expression was gone. She looked at me once, just once, with something I can only describe as the look of someone recalculating an equation whose answer keeps coming out wrong. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I met her eyes and held them for a moment, and then looked back at Warren's notes. Gloating is for people who need to see the other person's reaction in order to feel like they've won. I didn't need that. The outcome would speak for itself. It took 4 more months to finalize. There were a few skirmishes over minor items. A piece of furniture, a joint savings account that had maybe $12,000 in it, a timeshare we bought in the second year of the marriage, and both hated equally. Warren handled all of it. We split the timeshare liability right down the middle, which I considered fair since we'd both been equally foolish about buying it. In the end, the settlement was almost exactly what I'd expected. She walked away with what she'd brought to the marriage. A car with a loan balance that wasn't trivial, a small amount from the joint savings, and her personal belongings. The apartment she'd been living in, she'd moved out of the house around month 3, came with a lease in her name. The house, the investment accounts, the commercial property, the business interest, mine, had been mine, remained mine. I signed the final papers on a Wednesday morning. Warren had them arranged on his desk in the same orderly way he arranged everything. I read through each page, not because I didn't trust him, but because I don't sign things I haven't read. And then I signed each one with the kind of steady hand that comes from having made peace with a decision long before you're asked to execute it. Warren shook my hand afterward. He said, "You handled this about as well as anyone I've seen." "I had a good lawyer," I said. He smiled. It was a small smile, the kind you get from men who don't give them easily. I took it as a genuine compliment. I drove home. I made dinner. Something simple, something that required attention, because I find it easier to feel the edges of a thing when my hands are occupied. I stood at the counter and chopped and seasoned and thought about nothing in particular. And then I thought about everything, and then I went back to nothing again. I was genuinely relieved. Not happy exactly, not triumphant, just relieved the way you're relieved when a long noise finally stops, when you can finally hear the quiet that was always underneath it. The months after that were good, quietly good, in a way I hadn't expected. I kept mostly to myself, which I've always done well. I spent time with a couple of close friends, a man I'd known since my 20s who came over for dinner occasionally and asked exactly the right number of questions, and a woman from my building who'd gone through her own version of this story some years prior and who had a dry, practical way of discussing difficult things that I found more useful than sympathy. I started running again, which I'd let slide somewhere in the middle of the marriage. I reacquainted myself with the shape of my own days, the rhythm of waking when I wanted, eating what I wanted, spending evenings in whatever silence or company suited me. I also gradually started thinking about the future with a different quality of attention. Not urgency, more like curiosity. For the first time in years, the future felt open rather than predetermined. And there's a particular pleasure in open things that's hard to describe if you've spent too long in the predetermined. I didn't try to meet anyone. I wasn't ready for that, and I knew it. But I stopped dreading the prospect, which felt like enough progress for 1 year. The message came on a Thursday evening, 6 months after the papers were signed. I was on the back patio with a book and a glass of water, enjoying the last of the autumn light, when my phone lit up with her name. Carla. I looked at it for a moment. Then I set the book face down on the arm of the chair and picked up. "Hey," she said. "Hey," I said. There was a pause, the kind of pause that carries weight. "I wasn't sure you'd pick up," she said. "I almost didn't," I said, which was true. She laughed, but it was a thin laugh, and it died quickly. I waited. I've learned that waiting is often the most useful thing you can do in a conversation that the other person clearly needs to lead. "I've been thinking a lot," she said, "about everything, about how things went." "Okay," I said. "I think," she stopped, restarted. "I've made some mistakes. A lot of mistakes, actually, and I wanted to say that. I wanted you to hear it from me directly." "I hear you," I said. Another pause. "Things have been hard," she said. "Really hard. Harder than I expected." I didn't ask about Theo. I didn't need to. The phrasing, "harder than I expected," told its own complete story, and I'd known that story's outline since about month 2 of the separation. Some people are very exciting in the context of the forbidden and vanish entirely when that context evaporates. I never said that to Carla. I hadn't needed to. "I'm sorry that's been difficult," I said, because I meant it. Not sorry in a guilty way. I had nothing to be guilty about, but sorry the way you're sorry when anyone you once loved is suffering, even if the suffering was of their own making. "I miss you," she said. Then quickly, "I miss what we had. Or what we could have had, maybe. I don't know. I've been thinking about whether we—" She stopped. I waited. She said it. "Whether we made a mistake." I looked out at the yard. The last of the light was low and gold in the far corners, and the air had that early autumn smell, cold edges, dry leaves, something clean underneath. I breathed it in. I thought about the question she was really asking, which wasn't whether we had made a mistake, but whether I would be willing to absorb the consequences of her mistake and call it ours. I thought about the folder in the bottom drawer, about Warren's office, about the 2 mediation sessions, about her face in the second one when the arithmetic stopped working, about the Tuesday evening in November when she'd said separation in that practiced, rehearsed voice, and I'd understood everything I needed to understand. I thought about what I wanted my life to look like and how it currently looked, and the distance between those 2 images, which was smaller now than it had been in years. "Carla," I said, and my voice was quiet and even, "I don't think we made a mistake." "What do you mean?" "I mean, I think you made a choice, and I made one in response to it, and both of those choices were made with open eyes. I don't think they were mistakes. I think they were decisions." A long silence. "But if we talked," she said, "if we really talked." "We talked," I said. "We talked at a long table with lawyers on both sides for most of a year. And before that, I tried to talk to you when I still thought there was something to save. That wasn't quite true. I hadn't pushed very hard because I'd read the room accurately, but it was close enough to let stand. This isn't a conversation that leads somewhere new. I think you know that." Her voice, when she answered, was smaller. "I just thought. I know what you thought," I said, not unkindly. "But those circumstances have changed." That landed, I could tell. There was a quality to the silence that followed. "So that's it," she said. "That's it," I said. "I wish you well, Carla. I genuinely do. I hope things get easier." She said something quiet that might have been goodbye, and then the call ended. I set the phone down on the patio table and picked up my book and found the page I'd been on. The light was nearly gone now. I need to go inside in a few minutes. I sat with it for a little while, not with guilt, not with regret, not with any residual urge to call her back and offer something softer, just with the clean, settled feeling of a man who knows exactly where he stands. 3 weeks after that call, I met someone. That sounds like the punchline to something, but it wasn't. It was a dinner party in my friend's house, the one I'd known since my 20s, a small gathering, 6 people around a table that seated 8. She was a friend of his wife, recently returned from a couple of years working abroad. Her name was Mara. She had a direct way of speaking and an unhurried way of listening, and she asked me questions that were specific rather than polite, which I appreciated. We talked for most of the dinner and then afterward on the back porch for another hour. I told her I was recently divorced without elaborating, and she said she'd had her own version of that story and also didn't elaborate. And somehow that exchange established an easy understanding that took some couples months to arrive at. I drove home and sat in my car for a few minutes before going inside. I wasn't ready, I thought. And then I thought, maybe ready isn't the prerequisite I've always believed it is. Maybe ready is a thing you become by starting, not by waiting. I went inside. I found the dinner party host number and texted him. Your friend Mara? Would it be overstepping to ask for a number? He replied in 2 minutes with a string of enthusiastic commentary that I won't reproduce here, followed by her number. I thought about what to say for about 30 seconds. Then I sent a short, direct message. This is Thomas. We met tonight at Owen's. If you'd like to get coffee sometime, I'd be glad to. No pressure if not. Her reply came 20 minutes later. I'd like that. Saturday morning works for me if it works for you. I set the phone down and thought, yes, it does. Outside, the street was quiet. The neighborhood was settled into its nighttime arrangement. Porch lights, the occasional passing car, the particular stillness that comes when everyone else's day has ended and only a few people are still up, still thinking, still turning something over. I turned off the light in the kitchen. I went upstairs. I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling for a while, not out of worry or regret, but out of something closer to alertness. A forward-facing alertness. The kind you feel when you've closed one account and opened another, and the new one is blank and clean and waiting. The last thing I remember thinking before I fell asleep was that it had been a long time since blank and clean had felt like opportunity rather than loss. It felt like opportunity now. Saturday morning, I arrived at the coffee shop 8 minutes early. I ordered, found a table by the window, and sat with the quiet confidence of a man who has learned, through long and sometimes costly practice, that the most important negotiations are never the ones conducted across conference tables. They're the ones you conduct with yourself, in the hours between midnight and morning, when no one is watching and the only verdict that matters is the one you'll have to live inside. Mara arrived exactly on time. She sat down, folded her jacket over the back of her chair, and looked at me with the same direct, unhurried attention she'd given me at Owen's dinner table 3 nights prior. You're early, she said. Occupational habit, I said. What's the occupation? I smiled. Being thorough. She considered that for a moment, as if she was deciding whether it was an evasion or an answer. Then she smiled back, small, genuine, the kind that reaches the eyes, and picked up her menu. Fair enough, she said. I'll start somewhere else. Please do, I said, and she did.
Thanks for listening.